welcome to the latest episode of the Football Culture Podcast. Today we're welcoming back a former guest, and that is Rob Potts, who has written a book partly about his ground hopping travels, but we'll let Rob tell us more about the book himself. Rob, just for the listeners that may not have listened to the previous episode, just introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Hi James, thanks for inviting me back on. I'm Rob Potts. I live in Yorkshire, but if you can't tell from the accent, I'm from just outside Manchester in Salford originally. I'm a teacher, but I used to also be a sports journalist. And for the last couple of years, I have been travelling around mainly Europe, visiting football clubs, kind of meeting fans, looking at the differences and the cultural kind of nuances in all the different locations, and kind of compiling my findings, if you like, into a book that hopefully people are going to really enjoy and hopefully learn a little bit from as well.
Okay, great. So tell us a little bit about what the book is about.
It's essentially a global journey exploring football in 82 different locations around the world. So it starts off close to home. I look at a couple of non-league clubs in England, including Sheffield FC, who obviously have been in the news quite a lot just recently with the takeover with John McClure. And as the journey goes on, we start getting a little further afield. So we cross Europe, but then started looking at some really niche locations. So there's even chapters on football in Palestine, in Gaza, and also football in Israel. There's a chapter on the Tehran Derby, the Cairo Derby, all the way to kind of South America. And, you were good enough to contribute a couple of chapters there on River Plate and Boca. So it's a real trawl across the world. I think what probably makes it different from other football books is that it's focused very much on the culture, and the voices in the book I've tried to lean on fans. Okay, there are, the odd player interviews, the odd manager, club employees, but generally speaking, it's the fans who are giving their kind of voice to the culture at the clubs, what drives the clubs, and what's important amongst the fan bases.
Okay, so it's is it like a bit of a guidebook as well?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a hybrid. So, we explore the politics in each location, and we've kind of deliberately chosen clubs with an interesting story. So yeah, there are the big iconic brands, if you like, AC Milan, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich. But I've also tried to pick clubs that have actually got more of a story. So Rayo Vallecano, St. Pauli, clubs like that. And what I've tried to combine is kind of giving people an insight into what makes these clubs tick. Politically, what unites the fans, culturally, what kind of fuels the passion behind the clubs. And then from there, hopefully giving people a little bit of a hook. So when I'm exploring a club like, Red Star Belgrade, I want someone to read that, be intrigued, and think, right, I'm going to get on a plane. I'm going to make the effort. I'm going to get out there. So each chapter also gives kind of practical advice, if you like, what to do when you get there, how to get there, where to stay, what other things you need to look at other than the football. So it's very much a kind of hybrid book. It's different to, pretty much anything I think that's on the market or has been on the market previously.
Okay, so it's like part of the motivation of writing the book then, I guess, is for people to not only read and enjoy it, but to feel maybe inspired and want to go to some of the places in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And very much the tone of each chapter. Yeah, it's informative and you learn about these places and a little bit about the club history, but I've not lent too heavily on that because there's, that information is already out there. It's more about what it feels like to go to these places, what it feels like to turn up in Bruges on midday on a match day and make your way to the stadium, and, what makes that club different, say, to Anderlecht or Antwerp or whatever. And then from there, like you say, I want people to read that. I think that sounds amazing. And, the beta readers who looked at it, that's definitely the feedback we've had, that, it's made them want to travel more. It's made them want to visit some of the locations. It's made them as well want to visit places that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily think of going in the past.
Okay, so the book's called A Football Odyssey, Passion, Politics and the Beautiful Game. It's published by Bluemoose Books. Am I right in saying this is their first football book?
First ever, and I think if I'm right, I think it's probably the third non-fiction books. So to give you a bit of an idea about Bluemoose, I've always equated them to being the kind of factory records of the publishing world, if you like. They're an independent publisher, but they've put out some amazing titles, particularly in the fiction market. So, one of my favourite British novels of the past decade or so was The Gallows Pole by Benjamin Myers, which is all about the kind of coiners around the Halifax area and how they nearly crashed the British economy during the 1700s. And that was actually adapted by the BBC. So Shane Meadows came in and made a series of that for the BBC. And one of their big ones is Leonard and Hungry Paul by the Irish author Ron Hession, who's an amazing author. That's just literally been on the BBC as well. So that was adapted for the BBC over 6 parts. So they've got a track record of putting out really, really interesting books, mainly in fiction, but there's like Ghost Signs that won lots of awards and got lots of award nominations, which dealt with poverty during lockdown back in 2020. And I was attracted to work with them because I really love the values that they're driven by. I think publishing these days, a bit like football, is becoming very commercial, very commodified. A lot of the majors won't take risks, and when they do put things out, they tend to have to be formulaic and kind of driven by what's going to sell on the shelves at Asda. And I wanted to work with someone who's actually willing to do things a little bit different. I think because this is very different in terms of the format and the tone and the style as a football book, it's been a really good match. And the people at Bluemoose have been really encouraging and have kind of given me the freedom to take this book in, the direction I wanted to take it to. There's been no pressure why aren't you including Club X or Club Y. They've let me focus on clubs where there's a really strong narrative and where, I think the readers will be passionate about, what we're exploring.
Okay, well, yeah, it sounds a little bit like factory records, in terms of that creative freedom. Some younger listeners may not know who factory records are, or some non-UK listeners might not know. But in essence, they were a independent record label set up in the late 1970s, included bands such as Joy Division, New Order, Happy Mondays, many others, put out some early singles by the likes of James. So a pretty uber cool label, very famous for their catalogue numbers, building the Hacienda nightclub, and also as well a lot of their sleeve designs, which sometimes wouldn't tell you who the artists were. So you kind of had to be in on the design to actually know that it was a factory record, etc. So and I believe one of the factory records contract originally said all our bands have the freedom to fuck off. So factory just let creative people be creative. Sadly, in the early 90s, leading to the label folding. But I mean, they weren't the only independent label who that happened to. But yeah, so it sounds like a great publisher, and the listeners may well want to not only check out your book but check out some other titles.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I'd make the comparison between Factory and Bluemoose. You mentioned the sleeve designs at Factory, which are absolutely iconic. That gatefold sleeve for Blue Monday that, I don't know if you know the story, it was the biggest selling 12-inch single in history, but I think they lost 50 pence on every copy they sold because they were insistent on having this really beautiful gatefold design. Bluemoose, the covers are absolutely beautiful, really beautiful. And I think the job they've done on the cover of this book is really striking. You've seen the cover design, the Christ the Redeemer with the Flamengo shirt projected on it. It's absolutely stunning. I'm really pleased with. So that again, another tick in the box for Bluemoose.
Okay, so speaking of the cover then, so Christ the Redeemer, obviously in Rio de Janeiro, wearing a flamenco shirt. I mean, I was going to ask about some of the content of the book, but flamenco, I mean, obviously they're included in the book. You can tell the listeners about what makes Flamengo different from other Brazilian clubs.
I think it's the passion. I think the biggest club in Brazil. They've not only in Brazil but globally, they've got this massive following. Some of the people I interviewed from Flamengo, the Flamengo fans as well, speaking to them, you get a real sense of what a lifeline that club is. It's within touching distance of the favela, and for a lot of people, including some of the players who've got to play for Flamengo, it has been a lifeline. It has kept them out of poverty, perhaps kept them out of even worse. So it's that, you know, like with the Steve, it's that redemption story and flipping that, looking at things from football fans around the UK or Ireland. No coincidence that I chose that for the final chapter. That's the kind of dream location to go to the Maracanã, to go to that place that, you know, hosted all these memorable occasions. I think, you know, for a lot of people, that's the prize that can go.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, Flamengo is something of the people's club in Brazil. I mean, I don't think some people realise just quite how big Flamengo are in Latin America. Yeah. So, did you cover any other Brazilian clubs and indeed any other Latin American clubs?
I mean, this time around, I would have liked to have covered lots more, but I think the other one we chose for Brazil for a different reason, and again, it was narrative, was Santos, obviously, because of the connections with Pelé. And also, I really like the narrative about how they use the kind of spirit, the ghost of Pelé to entice Neymar back to the club. So that's the other Brazilian club. But there are clubs in each of the continents, including some where people perhaps know a little bit less about. You know, the A-League, Western Sydney Wanderers are one of the clubs. We looked at the Iranian League, the Egyptian League. So again, that was one of the beauties of going with the published spirit. There's no pressure to locally the big clubs that are going to get eyeballs. I was able to kind of be a little bit more niche. Go to, you know, clubs in El Salvador and Honduras and even, you know, Nigerian clubs. The great story of Nigeria, you know, there's a huge number of Nigerian players and Nigerian heritage players now across all the major leagues in Europe. But I suspect most fans in Europe know very little about the domestic league in Nigeria, the fan culture in Nigeria. So, you know, we had that freedom to do that and explore. So it is a really genuinely global sweep.
Okay, so what are some of the bigger clubs that are covered in there that people will know? And what are the more niche clubs, the ones that the listeners might not know so much about?
Yeah, so the bigger ones, they're obviously the non-negotiables. If people are wanting to travel the globe watching football, the chances are they're going to want to go, you know, to Barcelona. They're going to want to go to Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, AC Milan. So all of those big kind of blue chip clubs are in there. This time around, we stayed away from the Premier League. I partly because I didn't want to be kind of treading on the toes of any fans in England. Why have you not covered my club? But partly because I wanted to kind of take a different angle. So the English clubs I've covered actually non-league clubs, and again clubs with an interesting narrative. Choosing Sheffield FC, you know, the world's first football club, and it just felt logical that if you were, you're going to embark on this kind of global football odyssey, let's start where it begins. And with that being the first football club in the world ever, it seemed an obvious place to start. And obviously the events since I first visited make it even more interesting because you've got, you know, the rock star coming in and taking over the club and grand ambitions. And similarly, FC United, you know, I just thought it was a really interesting story. And you know, fans of one of the biggest clubs in the world walking away from that, being so disillusioned and starting again right at the bottom of the pyramid. So there are niche choices. The Irish chapters I really enjoyed writing because, again, one of the things that I love about football is the way that it acts as a touchstone, if you like, for culture and identity and politics. So going to Northern Ireland, you know, spending time there, you know, visiting the Peace Wall, you know, going back to Windsor Park, which I've not been to in, you know, over 20 years, and speaking to people there, and looking as well at, you know, the way that football, unfortunately, still demarcates people in different communities. You know, the majority of clubs in the top division of Northern Ireland represent loyalist communities, and you've got the one club that doesn't in Belfast that you know, you get that contrast. The League of Ireland, again, really interesting story, particularly the way that kind of really grew in popularity around the time the COVID outbreak hit. So it's a real mixed bag. So you've got these really big, really iconic clubs that I'm sure lots of people would love to go and visit, but alongside those, there are kind of smaller clubs where, you know, perhaps the narrative's more interesting. And I'm hoping that when people read about perhaps some of these less high-profile clubs and read how kind of interesting they are and how intriguing some of the locations are and how intriguing the fan culture is, it might actually make them look beyond the obvious when they're planning their next trip overseas.
So was there anything about some of the bigger clubs that you learned that surprised you?
Not really. I have to be honest with you. I think the bigger clubs mainly kind of filled my expectation. Paris was a really interesting chapter. I went to PSG, and the night I was there, if you remember last season, they played Aston Villa in the Champions League. And what was really interesting with that club was the way that, similar to what's unfortunately happened in the Premier League, those kind of ordinary working class fans, and particularly the young fans, the young Parisians, are being kind of driven out of the ground. And, speaking to young Parisians who are literally huddled on the street watching the TV, less than 300 yards from the ground, having to watch the game on televisions because they can't afford to get into the ground. And then when you're at the ground and around the ground, you're seeing all these kind of well-dressed people walking in on €400-500 tickets. So, unfortunately, yeah, in terms of the bigger clubs, it was in some ways quite depressing seeing how far removed football is becoming, not just in England, but now across the big clubs in Europe, from the people who, the game was birthed around.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in terms of the smaller clubs, where's there, places where listeners may never have thought of going before, that you discovered that is worth a visit, that maybe, because obviously we know the St. Pauli's, and then we know the bigger clubs, we know some of the niche clubs like Real Vallecano, etc. Was there any clubs that the listeners may not have thought of that you would recommend that they go and check out?
For me, the biggest shock and the nicest surprise was the League of Ireland. I was blown away by that. It's not a league that necessarily would be top of the list for a lot of groundhoppers, but I would urge people to go and look at it. It's almost like the people there have reclaimed football. It's a really raw experience. I went to Bohemians against Derry City last summer, and the place was rocking. The atmosphere is great. It's a club you can see they have no interest in being a corporate entity, far from it, and the fans feel really connected. It's a members club. So a few years back, when the club looked as though it might have gone to the wall, they were left with a decision. Do we sell out? Do we bring in outside investors like a lot of clubs around the world are doing? Or do we stick with our members only model, which we've had for the last, century? And actually the members unanimously said that, if it's sell out or die, we'll die, and remaining as a members club was the hill they would die on. And luckily, that's been vindicated, and the people running the club are really shrewd. So if you love your football shirts, you've probably seen some of the bow shirts and some of the collaborations that they do with the rock bands and whatnot, and some of the history around that ground as well. Some of it I knew a little bit about before I went, but when you're actually there, it blew your mind. So the ground itself, it's in Phibsborough. It's not too far from the centre of Dublin. It's definitely seen better days, so they're building a new ground, but they've made the most of it. Some of the artwork, some of the street art around the ground is just incredible. So they've, in the past, the Republic of Ireland use it as a base for international games. So there's a great mural of Jack Charlton. Bob Marley's played there. Thin Lizzy have played there. So it's just covered in these murals, but aside from the kind of set it with it, it was just, it felt like going to football when I was a kid, and that kind of feeling that, it was the people's game still. And that's the impression you get there. So yeah, the League of Ireland is something I was intrigued by, I was interested in, but I didn't expect to enjoy it quite as much as I did. And I'm really looking forward to getting back there. Other places that I really enjoyed, Vienna. It's a city I've always wanted to visit. I'm fascinated by history anyway. So Vienna, it's been the epicenter of European history for about 1,000 years. But the atmosphere, I went to a Rapid game, again, absolutely outstanding. And strangely, when I was traveling at the ground, sometimes the ultras culture, it can feel a little bit exclusive, if you like, and a little bit kind of menacing, intimidating. I never got that sense there for the most of the time. but the atmosphere is absolutely raucous. And again, it's that reconnection. The fans there feel really connected with the club. It didn't feel corporate, unfortunately, the way that perhaps some Premier League trips go. And again, we'll talk about these are small clubs. These are historically strong clubs. Unfortunately, just with the way the financial ecosystem in football now operates, with the Premier League and a handful of other clubs dominating Europe, these clubs have been pushed down the pecking order. But Ferencváros in Hungary was really fascinating. You know all about the politics of Hungary. Well, we said the recent election with Viktor Orbán being voted out of office, but the politics in Hungary are very kind of different to the politics in the UK, and it was really interesting to see how that intersected with the game of football, and the links were definitely there. But again, on match day, the atmosphere is electric. They've got a really beautiful stadium, but the acoustics are incredible, and that was a really enjoyable match day experience. That was the first trip to Budapest as well, and to get a chance to go, and Arsenal fans listening to this, you can get there by hook or by crook for the Champions League final, get yourself there. I've had a few Arsenal fans reaching out to my social media asking about that, who haven't got tickets but just want to be kind of part of the experience. So yeah, amazing place. And I guess the other one that really stands out, and again with my kind of interesting history here, was Belgrade. That was a really fascinating experience. Again, a ground that has seen better days, but you can still see the scars of that, that war that, for 2-3 decades ago. And that was really interesting to see that, and also somebody, growing up a lifelong Manchester United fan, see the steam that Belgrade still held in there. So the club, Red Star Belgrade, although they play at the Manchester Belgrade, the part ground on that occasion, but there's a whole section in there that really looked great. 2 hotels that the husband Dave spent time in, got memorials of both. So yeah, Belgrade was really fascinating. Again, enjoyed the city to visit. City that really enjoyable place to visit. Definitely somewhere that I'm going to.
Okay. Is there any sort of like political fallout with the clubs in the Balkans these days? I mean, obviously the war is in quite recent memory. Is this because obviously politics features quite heavily in the book? Is there a real strong sense of politics at these clubs?
Oh, it's absolutely, it's inescapable. There's a really strong ultras scene at Red Star. So their ultras group, De Liege, are a really strong group and are embraced by the club, like ultras groups are across Europe. The clubs realise that these people actually the lifeblood of the club. They keep the club going. If you go to the Maracanã, the De Liege shop at the Maracanã is actually probably twice the size of the official Red Star Belgrade club shop. It's huge, compared to the shop. If you know about your history, the ultras at De Liege were one of the groups where Arkan, the kind of Serbian warlord, if you like, he recruited from that during the Balkans conflict. So the scars are still there. You can see it on some of the street art at the stadium is very, very political. There's one huge mural as you get to the ground, kind of criticising UEFA are criminals, and that's to do with UEFA's acceptance of Kosovo into the fold. There's even a decommissioned tank right outside the ground, which is painted up in Red Star colours. So it's there, even on match day. I was sat, a lot of kids near me. I wasn't amongst the ultras, but the ultras are chanting something. I kind of got a gist, even though I don't speak any sort of Slavic languages. I got a gist of what was going on, and I turned to the guy behind me. They were chanting one thing, then the kids around me were reciprocating. And it turned out the ultras were chanting Kosovo, and the kids, who were 8, 9, 10, immediately chanting back is Serbia. So that political side of things, you can't get away from it. I think the way it manifests in football is interesting because 30 years ago, the Yugoslavian league was quite a strong league. You had strong teams from across each of the republics. You look at the two big Croatian clubs, Split and Dinamo Zagreb. You've got the teams in Mostar, in Sarajevo, the big Serbian clubs. It was a strong league, even though probably the Serbian Croatian teams were the strongest in it. what you've now got, and it's similar in other countries in Europe where there's been a little bit of fracturing, is a series of much weaker leagues. And what I noticed when I went to Red Star, the crowds were pretty low actually. When you go to a Partizan game, the place is rocking. But the weekend I was there, there were probably only 6,000 or 7,000 people there, and it makes you will there ever be a little bit of a together, which you think would be unthinkable, but actually a lot of the fans out there, a lot of them would embrace that, and there's a precedent because I think it's the Adriatic League in basketball. They've done just that. They've brought together teams from Bosnia, Croatia, Greece, and other places. So they've got that stronger league. And you're probably thinking, well, it's basketball, though it's different. If you actually look at the fan culture, because these are multi-sport clubs, it's the same people going watching. In a lot of cases, Red Star Belgrade play basketball, they play football, and the atmosphere and the culture is very reminiscent of Europe and America. Whereas it's kind of very corporate experience in Europe. On the ball. It's like watching a football game. You've got you've got the pyro and tifo and all these things going on. So I guess it's not unthinkable that perhaps on that match out there. But in the meantime, amazing place, really interesting.
Yeah, I would have thought probably that the authorities might be a bit skeptical about an Adriatic League, like just due to the bigger capacities in the stadiums. It could be a recipe for disaster. Like it's probably easier to contain a few thousand, passionate fans, but in basketball compared to like, hundreds of thousands of fans, with who are, shall we say, not on the best of terms.
Yeah, I would expect that to be one of these things that sounds like a good idea. And like I said, lots of the fans I spoke to in and around Belgrade, they would really welcome that, because I think the weakening of the Serbian league has been a problem for them. You've got maybe 2 or 3 strong clubs and a lot of also-rans. But again, it's that one of those things to go in that box mark too hard. And like you say, those are crossover the fan culture, the history, and the kind of the links with hooliganism, particularly somewhere like the former Yugoslav republics. It's worth remembering one of the big kind of iconic moments, if you like, ahead of the outbreak of conflict between Serbia and Croatia was that kung fu kick by Bolam during the game against Red Star, which kind of been immortalised now. People saying it was the kick that started a war. It was quite a way before the war, but those memories, still live large, don't they, for a lot of people? And like I say, when you visit Belgrade, even just looking at some of the street art, the war might be a couple of decades ago, but the memories are still quite fresh and the wounds are still quite raw.
Okay, so of all the places you went researching the book, who would you say, it doesn't have to necessarily be the best, but what was your favorite fan culture, or what fan culture do you think, what country has got it right in terms of fan culture?
That's a really good question, and you bringing that up, it actually makes me think about fandom in the Premier League back in England. And I'm thinking particularly about the Holmesdale Fanatics at Crystal Palace, who've kind of embraced this very kind of continental Europe style of fandom. And it's dividing opinion. A lot of people are split between, well, this is cringe, and you got other people saying, actually, we have a problem in the Premier League. The atmosphere in the ground is not what it should be, and at least these people are addressing it. And I can see logic in both arguments. I think that kind of very European style of kind of ultras culture, when you're there and when you're used to slightly more sanitized atmospheres in the Premier League, it's brilliant. And, I would advise, any fan who gets the opportunity to go and watch football in some of these places and see the kind of choreographed, if you like, and coordinated fan experience in those grounds. You look at most of the grounds will have that podium, and you have the sort of lead of the ultras with his loudspeaker, coordinate what goes on, and it almost seems what happens on the pitch is slightly detached from what's happening in the stands. Whereas in England, I think the fan culture and what happens in the stands, it's more kind of organic and responsive, if you like. Where I thought the interesting bit was where you go to maybe Belgium or the Netherlands, particularly Rotterdam at Feyenoord. And it's a little bit of a fusion of the two. You get the kind of best elements of both. So, visit Club Brugge, that was really enjoyable, and seeing the way even some of their songs, you've got I was going to say bilingual, you're actually a trilingual country, and you've got the little German portion, but you've got this bilingual country, Bruges in the kind of Dutch Flemish speaking region, but they're singing songs and chants in English. So I went to the Bruges versus Antwerp game of last season, and you've got the Antwerp fans singing Bruges is a shithole, I want to go home. But again, it's that kind of elements of the European fan culture, which I'm sure people are really unexperienced, but then those familiar aspects that they've kind of blended together, and the influence of probably 1970s football culture. I think a football culture that in some respects back home has kind of dwindled a little bit. So, Bruges have got this kind of link with Liverpool from facing them in European competition in the 70s. So it's one of those clubs, there's quite a few clubs actually in Europe who's, you get there and singing You'll Never Walk Alone. But Feyenoord, again, in Rotterdam, I think all three of the big three in the Netherlands. And Feyenoord is, an amazing atmosphere, but although it's got elements of that European culture, it felt very familiar. And again, singing songs, some of them in English, but singing songs that we would be familiar with as English or UK-based fans.
Yeah, I remember Rob Essex this season played Feyenoord in the Europa League, and they were singing songs in English. Yeah. Which the some of the Betis fans didn't notice the difference between that or Dutch, but some did. And yeah, I think Spain's kind of similar to that as well. There is the element of there's generally a better atmosphere than in England, and the ultras do sing pretty much all through the game. However, they are louder and noisier like the rest of the stadium if something on the pitch is keeping everyone interested. It's just like I remember playing Atletico Madrid in the Copa del Rey this season, and at the point it was 5-0 to Atletico. It was still a bit of an atmosphere from the goal saw, but the rest of the stadium was pretty quiet as you could imagine.
One of the interesting things about ultras culture as well, and a lot of it is they'll plan which chants they're going to do at which points of the game, and it's all very kind of coordinated from the start. You watch a game in England, and if you're watching on TV, the commentator will say something like, well, they need to do something, they need to get the crowd going. You don't tend to get those same lulls in Europe. Winning or losing, they're going to go through their repertoire, and they're going to keep that energy, if you like, from the first minute to the 90th minute. So I think sometimes people, when they hear about ultras culture, and obviously that word hooligan as well, which in the UK has got hugely negative connotations, and you had the whole purge under Thatcher, who had this kind of crusade against football fans. In Europe, the term hooligan doesn't really mean the same thing. I remember going to Sparta Prague, and my ticket was for the section where the ultras were there, and I was stopped by a police officer. No, you can't go here. This is for Czech hooligans only. And they swapped my ticket and sent me to another part of the ground. But it wasn't. There were no negative connotations there. And what you realise actually, what they call ultras there really are kind of traditional working class fans, the sort of fans who in a lot of grounds unfortunately can't afford to go or have been marginalised at clubs. So I think we probably learn a lot from that, and I can see why the Palace fans have kind of taken to that, if you like, to address something that is a problem in England. Another really good example of that is Sweden as well. I went to Malmo, they were playing Djurgården, and the power of their fans is something that we should be envious of. We've obviously had the story recently with Liverpool and the price increases and some of their fans really trying to make their voices heard. That's still there in Sweden. They've got a 50+1 system similar to the one in Germany. The fans, the fans there will tell you Swedish football is nowhere near at the level it is in other countries, but they would not swap it, because the difference between the game in Sweden and the game in, say, England is that the clubs are theirs. They are the driving forces behind those clubs. So a perfect example of that is there's no VAR in Sweden. And the reason for that being, when it was put to the vote, the fans said no. And because the fans were, the clubs were at least 51% fan-owned, that was it. It killed it dead in the water. So in Sweden, you don't have this kind of interminable wait and this kind of frustrating pause we seem to take for granted now when a goal scored. Almost like you want to jump up and punch the air and do all the things that you go to football for, but you have to wait just in case someone in a box in a bunker 60, 70 miles down the road wants to give it away. So that was the big takeaway for me, seeing the way that fans in different countries in different ways across Europe and elsewhere have still got that control, and the club belong to the people who built the clubs. And for me, that's probably one of the biggest takeaways from the book.
Well, that all sounds great, and I'm sure the listeners will look forward to reading all about it in the book, and hopefully that can also not only enjoy reading about what the various fan cultures are like all around the world, but also perhaps learn a few things that they didn't know, and as well maybe feel inspired to take a trip to some of these places. So, Rob, when's the book out? Where can people get it?
Okay, so the book is released on Friday the 12th of June. It'll be available in all the kind of major shops in the UK, the ones, Waterstones, etc. Obviously, I'd urge people, if you can, get yourself to the independent bookshops as well and really, really support them. It's available on all of the major online platforms as well. So the main one, the name of it, it's already on there to pre-order, and wherever you are, it should be fairly easily available. And there's a chance, hopefully that at some point there'll be translated versions as well, probably to the German, French, Spanish markets. So, but again, a lot of that will depend on how well things go back in the UK.
Okay, cool. Well, get out and grab yourself a copy. And also, Rob, where can the listeners follow you on social media?
Okay, so I'm on all the major platforms. So I'm on X, or Twitter as it used to be. Still, I'm not one of those. I'm still there, hanging in as RJP_rights, and then across the other platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, I'm on there as the Global Ground Opera, and you'll see my logo. It's got a kind of ultra there with his face covering and black and yellow kind of Penarol coloring on there. So yeah, Global Ground Opera across all the platforms.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, Rob, thanks very much for coming on and telling us all about the book. Looking forward to reading my copy when I get it. And to the listeners, tell your friends about the Football Culture Podcast. Follow us on all the socials, and like and subscribe, and throw some comments. Tell us what you like, what you don't like, what you'd like to hear on the show in the future, and we'll see you on the next episode.